The wine glass didn't shatter when it hit the floor. It just cracked. A clean split down the middle, two perfect halves, still holding their shape even as the contents spread dark and slow across the white marble. That was the detail Nadia kept returning to afterward. Not what he said, not the faces of the people who sat there and watched him say it. Just the glass, holding itself together out of habit, even after everything inside it had already spilled. She had known, walking into the Hargrove estate that evening, that the night would be difficult. She had known it the way she always knew. Not from anything anyone said, but from the particular quality of the silence that greeted her when she stepped through the door. The kind of silence that has a texture to it, that lands on your skin. The Hargroves held their annual spring gathering at their property outside Oakville every May. 40 acres of curated countryside, a main house that had been featured in Architectural Digest twice, and a guest list that had not changed in any meaningful way in 30 years. Old money, mostly. Some new money, but the kind that had learned to dress itself in old money's clothes. Politicians, board members, the occasional retired judge who no longer needed to perform neutrality and had therefore stopped trying. Nadia had been coming to these gatherings for 6 years. 6 years of arriving on the arm of Elliot Hargrove, the youngest son, the one the family still privately referred to as a late bloomer, which was the Hargrove way of saying they had expected more from him and were still waiting. 6 years of standing in rooms full of people who greeted her with a certain kind of smile, warm on the surface, measuring underneath. 6 years of being the only black woman in nearly every photograph, and still somehow ending up outside the frame in the ones that mattered. She had met Elliot at a conference in Vancouver. She had been speaking on a panel about ethical AI in financial services. He had been in the audience, and afterward, he had found her at the reception and told her that her talk had changed the way he thought about something, and she had been too tired to ask him what, specifically. And so, they had simply talked for 2 hours about other things, and by the end of the evening she had agreed to have dinner with him the following week. He was kind, in the way that people who have never had to fight for anything can sometimes be. A kindness that came from ease rather than understanding, which was not the same thing, but which she had told herself for a long time was close enough. His family had not been unkind to her, exactly. That was the thing that made it difficult to name. There was no single moment she could point to in those early years, no incident that stood alone as evidence. It was the accumulation of small things. The way his mother, Constance, a woman who wore her silver hair like a crown and spoke in a register that suggested she had never once been in a hurry, would ask Nadia, each time they met, what it was she did again. As though the answer might have changed. As though the answer, which was the same every time, had not yet managed to stick. Nadia Pemberton Cross ran a technology company. She had founded it at 31, in a one-bedroom apartment in Toronto's East End. With $60,000, she had saved over 7 years working jobs that had nothing to do with technology. Because technology was what she had taught herself at night, on a second-hand laptop, after her shifts ended. The company was called Vaulted. It built infrastructure software for mid-size financial institutions. The kind of software that nobody outside the industry could explain at a dinner party, but that had, over the course of 8 years, become quietly indispensable to a significant portion of the Canadian banking sector. She had taken the company public 4 years ago. The offering had been oversubscribed. She now held a board seat at 2 of the institutions whose infrastructure ran on her software, and she had recently been appointed to an advisory panel on digital finance by the federal government. She did not, as a rule, lead with any of this. It was information that existed. People who needed to know it knew it. Constance Hargrove asked what she did again every single time they met. Nadia answered the same way every time. And Constance nodded in a way that suggested she had heard the words without receiving them and moved the conversation elsewhere. There was the matter of the family photograph at the previous year's gathering, the one taken on the east lawn, with the maple trees in the background and the afternoon light doing what afternoon light does in May in Ontario. The photographer had arranged everyone in 2 rows, and Nadia had been placed at the far left edge, and then, in the second arrangement, the one that became the framed print in the hallway, she had somehow ended up a half step outside the grouping, standing at a slight remove from the rest, her shoulder just beyond the border of the composition, so that in the final image she appeared less like a family member and more like someone who had happened to be walking past when the shutter clicked. She had noticed. Elliot had not. There was the evening 2 years ago when she had been standing near the bar during the pre-dinner hour, and Elliot's brother, Pierce, had appeared beside her and said, with a laugh that was clearly meant to suggest he was joking, that she must be very good for Elliot's image. Diversity hire, he'd said. Just kidding, he'd added immediately, before she could say anything. You know I'm just kidding, right? And she had smiled, because the room was full of people, and Pierce was watching her with the specific alertness of someone waiting to see whether she would make a scene, and she had learned over time that making a scene in that house cost her more than it cost anyone else. So she had smiled and said, of course, and Pierce had laughed again and moved away, satisfied. The comments about her hair had begun sometime in the 3rd year. Not from Constance, that would have been too direct, and directness was not how the Hargroves operated. From the women adjacent to the family. Friends of friends. The ones who arrived in linen and cashmere and stood in clusters on the terrace and had known each other since their children were in the same prep school programs. One of them, a woman named Beverly, who had the particular confidence of someone who had never once considered that her opinions might be unwelcome, had touched Nadia's hair during the 3rd gathering, just reached out and touched it, without asking, and then said that it was interesting, and then turned back to her conversation. Nadia had stood there for a moment. She had then excused herself and gone to find a bathroom, where she had run cold water over her wrists and looked at herself in the mirror above the sink for a long time. She had thought about her grandmother's house in Scarborough, which had smelled like cardamom and floor wax, and the particular warmth of a space that had been inhabited fully and without apology. She had thought about what her grandmother would say if she could see her standing in this bathroom. She already knew the answer. She had turned off the tap and gone back to the party. That had been year 3. There had been a year 4, and a year 5, and now a year 6. And the question of why she had kept coming was one she had asked herself and been unable to answer in a way that satisfied her. Love, partly, or something that had started as love and had over time become more like commitment, more like not wanting to admit that she had been wrong about something. The stubborn arithmetic of sunk cost, the specific difficulty of leaving a situation that had never technically crossed a line, that had only ever approached one, repeatedly, from a safe distance. Elliot had never said that what his family did was acceptable. He had also never said that it was not. The evening of the 6th gathering began the way all the others had, with drinks on the terrace, with the light coming in low over the property, with the murmur of conversations that had been having themselves, in different configurations for decades. Nadia wore a deep green dress she had bought in Montreal. She had her hair up. She had decided, on the drive out, that she would allow herself 3 hours and then suggest to Elliot that they head back to the city, citing an early call in the morning, which was not a lie. She had a call at 8 with her head of product, which she had scheduled specifically so that she would have a reason to leave. The seating at dinner was arranged by Constance, as it always was. Nadia had been seated between a retired appellate court judge named Harold and a woman named Susan, who sat on the board of a hospital foundation, and had the kind of energy that suggested she was accustomed to running meetings. Elliot was seated 3 places down, next to his mother, which was where Constance always placed him. The first 2 courses passed without incident. The judge talked about fly fishing. Susan talked about a fundraising gala. The wine was very good. The Hargroves had a cellar that had been assembled over 30 years, and whatever else one could say about them, they were serious about this one thing. The conversation moved the way it always moved in that room, in careful, expensive circles, never landing anywhere uncomfortable. It was during the third course that Pierce, from across the table, said something to the woman beside him that made her laugh in a way that drew the attention of the table. And then Pierce, emboldened by this, said something Nadia did not fully hear. And the woman laughed again, and then Pierce looked at Nadia with an expression she recognized. The particular look of someone who was about to say something he had already decided he was entitled to say. He said that Elliot had always had interesting taste. The table did not go quiet. It just shifted. A slight recalibration of posture. The judge reached for his water glass. Nadia set down her fork. Elliot, 3 seats away, said nothing. She looked at him. He was looking at his plate. Pierce continued, speaking now in a tone that was performing lightness while carrying something else entirely, saying that he meant it as a compliment, that Elliot had always done things his own way. He smiled at Nadia when he said this. The smile that had a door in the back of it, that he had already decided she was not invited through. Constance, at the head of the table, said nothing. The retired judge reached for his water glass again, although he had not drunk from it the first time. Susan was looking at a point somewhere above Nadia's shoulder. Nadia picked up her fork again. She cut a piece of something and put it in her mouth and chewed it and tasted nothing. She had been here before, not exactly here, but in adjacent versions of here. And she knew that the room was watching her to see what she would do, and that whatever she did would be the thing that was remembered, and not what Pierce had said, or the way he had said it, or the quality of the silence that had allowed it. Elliot said quietly that Pierce should probably leave it. Pierce said that he was just talking. Elliot said that Pierce knew what he meant. Pierce looked at Elliot for a moment, and then looked at Nadia, and said, and this was when the wine glass that had been standing at Pierce's elbow got swept to the floor, though by whom and in what precise sequence of movement was something that different people at the table would later remember differently. He said that Elliot should be careful not to forget who his family was. The glass hit the marble. The room went still. Nadia looked at the glass. She looked at the 2 clean halves of it, holding their shape. Then she looked at Elliot. Elliot was looking at his plate. She waited. The kind of waiting that has an internal clock in it, that is counting down from a number she had set without consciously deciding to set it. She waited for him to say something, to look up, to do any one of the several things that were available to him in that moment that would have meant something. He reached for his own glass and took a drink. And that was the end of something. She could feel it end. Not dramatically, not with any particular flourish, but with the specific flat finality of a door closing in an empty house. The sound of it was very quiet. She was possibly the only person in the room who heard it. She set her napkin on the table. She stood up. The judge looked at her. Susan looked at her. Constance, at the head of the table, looked at her with an expression that revealed nothing, which Nadia understood by now was itself a kind of expression. She said, to no one in particular, that she was going to get some air. She walked out of the dining room, and down the hall, and through the side door, and onto the gravel path that ran along the east side of the house. The night was cold in the particular way that Ontario nights are cold in May. Not winter cold, but reminder cold. The kind that tells you the warmth is still provisional. She stood on the path and looked out across the dark property and breathed. She had her phone in her hand. She had not realized she had brought it with her. She looked at it and saw that there were 3 messages from her head of communications, all sent within the past hour, with increasing levels of urgency, the third of which read simply, "Call me when you can." "It's a good thing," she called. Her communications director, a sharp and unflappable woman named Grace, who had been with Vaulted since the early days, and who did not use the phrase, "it's a good thing," unless she meant it, answered on the second ring and said that BNN Bloomberg had just aired a segment on their special edition broadcast. The segment was about Vaulted. Specifically, it was about the federal government's announcement earlier that day, which Nadia had known was coming, but whose timing she had not been told, that Vaulted had been selected as the primary infrastructure partner for a new national digital payments framework. A 10-year contract. The kind that, Grace said, the Chiron was calling the most significant fintech partnership in Canadian history. They had used her name, her photograph, the one from the Governor General's Innovation Awards ceremony 2 years ago. Grace said the phones were going. Nadia said she understood and that she would call back in the morning and that Grace should go home. She hung up. She stood on the gravel path in the cold May night and looked at the dark sky above the Hargrove property and felt something she could not immediately name. Not triumph, not satisfaction exactly. Something quieter than either of those things. Something that felt, more than anything, like the recognition of a distance she had traveled and had never until this moment allowed herself to fully measure. She went back inside. She had intended, walking back down the hall, to say nothing, to collect her coat and her bag, to find Elliot, to speak to him privately, to leave. But when she came back through the door of the dining room, she found that the room had not resumed. The guests were still sitting. Elliot was still at the table, and the television mounted in the adjacent sitting room, the one that was never on during dinner, that was there primarily for major hockey games and the occasional federal election night, was on. Someone had turned it on, and the segment was still running. Her photograph was on the screen. Her name was on the screen, in the Chiron, in white letters on a blue field. Nadia Pemberton Cross, it said, and below it, the capacity in which she was being referenced, and the value of the contract, and the word historic. The room was very quiet. Constance Hargrove was looking at the television with an expression that was, for the first time in 6 years, something Nadia could actually read. It was the expression of someone revising a calculation, the specific recalibration of a person who has been operating on a set of assumptions that have just been quietly, publicly, and entirely rearranged. Pierce was not looking at the television. He was looking at the tablecloth. The retired judge said, to no one in particular, that he had thought the name sounded familiar. Elliot was looking at Nadia. She was not looking at him. She walked to the table and picked up her napkin, which she had folded neatly when she stood to leave, and unfolded it and placed it across her lap and sat back down. She reached for her water glass. She drank from it. She set it down. Around her, the room slowly, cautiously resumed. She ate the rest of her meal. She spoke when spoken to. She answered the judge's questions about Vaulted with the same patient precision she used in every interview, every board meeting, every room where she had ever had to explain herself to people who had not thought to be curious about her before circumstance gave them a reason. When dinner was finished and the guests began to move toward the sitting room for coffee, she found Elliot in the hallway. He was standing near the window at the end of the hall, looking out at the dark lawn, and he turned when he heard her come through the door, and there was something in his face that she recognized. The look of a person who had understood something too late, and who wanted to begin a conversation about it, and who was hoping the other person would give him the opening. She did not give him the opening. She said that she would be taking the car service back to the city. She said that her bag was already in the front hall. She said that she hoped the rest of the evening was good. He said her name. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the glass, how it had held its shape even after everything inside had spilled. She thought about her grandmother's floor, the way it had always been warm. She thought about a panel she'd sat on 12 years ago, long before Vaulted, long before any of this, where someone had asked her what she would say to young women from difficult backgrounds who were trying to make something. And she had said, and she still believed this, she had believed it every day since she'd said it, that the work was the answer. Not the recognition, not the room, the work. She said goodnight to Elliot Hargrove. She walked down the hall. She collected her coat from the front closet. A long charcoal wool coat that she had bought for herself on the day Vaulted Series B closed, which she wore specifically on evenings when she felt she needed the reminder of what she had built and how she had built it. She picked up her bag. She went through the front door of the Hargrove estate and down the stone steps and across the gravel drive to the waiting car. She did not look back at the house. The driver asked if she was going back to the city. She said she was, He pulled out of the long driveway and onto the road, and the lights of the estate receded in the rear window. And Nadia Pemberton Cross opened her phone and looked at the messages from Grace, and from her board chair, and from a journalist she respected at the Globe, who was asking if she had time to speak in the morning, and from a number she didn't recognize that turned out to be someone from the Prime Minister's communications office. And she looked at all of these messages in the dark of the car. As the highway opened up ahead of them, the city lights beginning to glow on the horizon, and she put her phone face down on the seat beside her and looked out at the road. She had an 8 o'clock call, she had a company to run. She had, as it turned out, a contract to deliver that would reshape a piece of how this country moved its money, which was not something she had set out to do in order to prove anything to anyone, but which had turned out, as the best work usually does, to matter regardless of the reason she had started it. The car moved through the dark. The city came closer. And Nadia, who had learned a long time ago that the most powerful thing you could do in a room full of people who had decided not to see you was to become impossible to ignore, said nothing at all and watched the road and went home.